Peach Pundit, the podcast, is a conversation filled with the personal opinions of the people who are participating. Any view or opinion expressed belongs only to the person who expressed it and not with anyone with whom that person is professionally affiliated. Gather round, you election nerds, because I have a very special treat for you for this podcast. Buzz is not with us. I think he told me he was in Salt Lake City doing a conference. He's out there fighting for freedom and liberty somewhere. Wherever Buzz is, that's what he's doing. But it gave us this opportunity that we've been trying to make happen for several weeks now, and I'm really excited to finally have the opportunity to sit down with Joseph Kirk, who is the Election Supervisor for Bartow County, just next door to me, and also the president of GAVREO. What does GAVREO stand for, Joseph?
It's the Georgia Association of Voter Registration and Election Officials.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
And I think it'd be apropos if we let the audience know it takes a special type of person to think, I'm going to make elections a career. And you've done that. So why did you decide to one day to get involved and say, I want to work in elections?
You know, I appreciate you not saying the more honest way, which is takes a special kind of crazy to make a career out of.
It didn't used to take a special type of crazy. It's only in the last 5 years that it seems like.
I think even back then, we just hit it better back then. But so my journey started way back, I think 2001, 2002, that area. I worked for an organization called the Center for Election Systems at Kennesaw State University that helped implement the original voting system in Georgia, and worked with that system throughout college, either on the county level, under contract for different counties, or during the summer at the state level, testing voting machines. I went to the University of Georgia, my degree is in computer science. When I graduated, I went to Mississippi for 2 years and worked for Secretary of State out there because that was one of the times the bubble burst of computer scientists. I was going to have a really hard time finding a job in programming back then, but I had training that nobody else had on voting systems and chose to go in that direction. Came back to Bartow County in 2007. I grew up in Floyd County, right next door, wanted to be closer to my family, and have been here ever since, and really can't imagine about doing anything else for a living. I love my job. I love my community. I get to do different things every single day. It's no 2 days are the same. And for me, that's very important. And it's taken me some places I never expected it to. But anyone thinking about a career in elections, I highly recommend it. It's, believe it or not, what I do is not political at all. I just count stuff and facilitate the process. And it really is a beautiful thing.
So it's sort of like an umpire or a referee. The game is played. The players are on the field. They're fighting each other. And all you're doing is calling balls and strikes and making sure that the game is played according to the rules.
Exactly. We add a little bit of education in there, making sure both sides know what the rules are and they're both playing by the same rule book. And that about covers it.
Great. So tell us a little bit about GAVREO. What is it? How long has it been around? Why is it important?
So GAVREO has only been around for a few years now, but there were two preceding organizations, one for voter registration, one for elections, VRAG, the Voter Registrar Association of Georgia, and GEOA, which is the Georgia Election Association of Georgia, was. Because you have to remember that back in the day, there were two entities at the county level that ran elections. There was a board of registrars that registered the voters, and then a probate judge that was the election superintendent that counted the votes and facilitated that voting process. And over the years, that probate judge moved to a board, and then eventually the two boards combined in most counties to a combined board of voter registration and elections. And there's only a few counties now that have separate offices for that. But we realized after those two organizations existed for 20, 30 years that we all had basically the same goal. We were having two different conferences for training when we were covering a lot of the same material at both conferences. And it made a lot of sense to combine. So there was only one training conference to go to every year. And back then, really all we did was have a training conference. The Secretary of State's office is in charge of the ongoing certification training to be an election administrator in Georgia. And the original certification training comes from them right now. It's an online training class or series of classes. But the continuing education was done mostly at this annual conference. But since we've combined, since we've seen the need, we've started growing. And now we have, for example, legislative effort. We have a system of support between counties where counties are supported by their peers in their area, can share best practices, give us a great method of communication to those counties. And there's other programs in the works because the fact of the matter is we're only as strong as our weakest link. And even though the local boards of elections have a lot of authority, or so to say combined boards, a lot of authority over how elections are conducted in their counties, the public doesn't necessarily realize that. So when one of us fails somewhere in the state, it comes back on all of us. Not to mention that one of the reasons I love working in elections is it's such a supportive environment. I've never been involved in any community before that takes such care in supporting everyone in that community. And that's true within the regions of the state itself, and across the country. No matter what I'm working on in elections, there's always a lot of support, and we're always trying to help each other.
So is every county election supervisor in Georgia a member of GAVREO?
There's no requirement for that. I don't know where we stand right now. They didn't have to be a member to come to our conference, but most did join. If there's any who aren't members, it's, I would guess, an oversight on their part. It's not always a supervisor. It could be a board member. It could be all the board and all the office staff. It really depends on the county. But we recently changed our membership model moving forward. So there's a county membership rather than individual membership to make it easier for us to serve everyone in that county and give the access to all of our resources we provide.
So when there are changes to election law, like we have seen this happen a lot, and this is what I've encouraged the legislature since I've left, is to adopt this attitude of continuous improvement. And it brings my heart a little bit of warmth to hear legislators now saying we need to be adopting continuous improvement when it comes to election law, because there are threats that are out there that we may not know exist today. The legislature only meets 40 days a year. They can only do so much every year to address these emerging threats. Sometimes it takes them a long, long time to actually pass a bill into law to address those things. When those changes happen, what is the role of GAVREO in making sure everybody's on the same page?
Well, in the past, we've always had a training session at our annual conference from the Secretary of State's office on what laws have changed. And it's fallen very much to the Secretary of State's office to train the different counties on the changes in law and implement any statewide changes that need to be made. We do have a top-down system in Georgia, meaning the Secretary of State is the chief election official, and has certain calls to make in that role. That doesn't mean the counties have no power. We have a lot of authority in local decisions, but a lot of that statewide training comes from the Secretary of State's office. Now that we are growing, I foresee having more training sessions throughout the year. We're looking at doing webinars to help educate our members, answer questions, push things out through what we call regional facilitators that have at least quarterly meetings that share best practices, talk about changes, things like that. So this is all evolving as we're speaking, but I think the most important part of our efforts so far have been to be involved with that legislative process from the get-go. Our preceding organizations, the thought process was that not every county is the same, so we should all just go to our local legislators, tell them what we think and what the legislative process works. But unfortunately, in practice, that's not as effective as having a single voice directly to the committee, to be part of that conversation. This is how we met back in the day, was me coming just as myself to talk during public comment at committee meetings.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more involved we get in that process of not necessarily helping set the policy, but helping to set how we're going to get to that policy. What's going to work in law with the other laws, because you're right, we always have to improve. The idea of continuous improvement is spot on, I think. If for no other reason, there's always unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And as we find these unintended consequences, we need to address them in a way that works for the offices, works for the voters, works for the candidates. And I think we're all keeping a sort of a list of things that we might want to mention later. And now we're starting to work as an organization to develop the priorities.
That's That is tremendous because having that organized voice, I remember when I brought a bill to get us off of the old touchscreen debold machines, I just wanted to make sure that there was some sort of paper trail, that there was a paper ballot that was the ballot of record that voters could have confidence in, that they weren't just touching a screen, it was on the back end
Right.
tallying that in some sort of spreadsheet software. I was one of the first legislators I ever heard use the words voter confidence and election integrity.
Yeah.
And having this idea that paper is the way, it is the most secure election that you can have is on some sort of paper, whether it's ballot marking devices, hand marked paper ballot, but there's something physically that the voter can look at and verify this is who I intended to vote for before they drop that into the box. And there was not uniform in the reaction. And there were some people, I remember very clearly one election supervisor screaming at me in the hallway in the legislative office building, telling me, hey, if I ever have to touch another paper ballot, I'm just going to quit because that is a nightmare. This debold machine is the best thing ever. And it's turned out that the debold machines weren't manufactured into perpetuity, and they started falling apart. And we heard stories of local counties having to go to eBay to purchase spares so that they could have parts in case their equipment broke down because Diebold wasn't making them anymore. We had to do something. How receptive to change are the election supervisors in Georgia? Is it something that they're generally resistant to it, or is there an openness to it now? Have they evolved that way towards change?
That's a good question. I don't want to speak for my peers.
Speak for yourself. This is
Words in their mouth.
Scott asking Joseph.
But what I will say is I've seen the newer people coming into the profession have a very different attitude than, say, the folks that have been here for years and years and years. Talking to the press is a good example. Well, when I first started working in elections, we were taught, if not in these exact words, to avoid talking to the press. Just kind of hunker down, let the storm pass. But what we've learned is if we don't tell our own story, someone's going to do it for us.
Right.
And again, I appreciate you having me on today to tell my story. I think it's important. I appreciate the platform. Your megaphone's much bigger than mine. But so as we see folks come in that are new, that are coming, they're younger, I think they are not nearly as resistant to change as folks that have been working in the profession for 30, 40 years. But there's always something scary about change and the unknown. And we've seen in the past as different laws, the voting system changed. For example, maybe things were left out of law that needed to be there, or the interpretation wasn't right there to begin with. Part of that hesitancy is trying to make sure that everything's there as we need it to be. Because once we hit a certain point in the process, nothing's changing. Taking with the voting system example, there is a not small amount of work that it takes to educate the public on a new voting system.
Oh, yeah.
And you want to have the entire playbook in front of you when you start, not develop it as you get.
Yes.
So I think that when we're talking about changes, if they're well thought out, we have all the information about how it's going to work in front of us, my colleagues will be much more likely to accept the change than if there's a lot of unanswered questions.
So the Georgia House of Representatives this year has established a blue ribbon study committee on election process. When we come back, we're going to dive into that. So stay tuned. Americans for Prosperity Georgia champions economic freedom and individual liberty across the state. They advocate for lower taxes, less government spending, and regulatory reform while mobilizing citizens to engage in the legislative process. Beyond just economic issues, AFP Georgia is committed to more choice in K through 12 education for all students and removing government barriers in healthcare, like Certificate of Need. Thank you to our friends at Americans for Prosperity for being a partner-level Patreon to the Peach Pundit podcast. We appreciate them and Tony West and all their team over there. They do great work. If you too would like to be a Patreon, head on over to patreon.com/peachpundit. Our tier started at only $5. We had a new anonymous Patreon sign up this week. The list keeps on growing of the people who rock. So again, it's voluntary. You don't have to do it. We would just really appreciate it if you did. Patreon.com/peachpundit. And also leave a comment. We've got a lot of comments recently that have been entered into our merch giveaway. Every comment you leave gives you one more entry into that merch giveaway. You might get a t-shirt, a hat, or a sticker or something. Most likely a t-shirt, since we got a bunch of those laying around. But check it out.
Golden Retriever Rescue of Atlanta, GRRA, is an all-volunteer, tax-deductible charitable organization. They are dedicated to providing veterinary care, comprehensive evaluation, and foster and adoptive homes to Golden and Labrador retrievers who are abandoned, mistreated, neglected, or left in shelters throughout Georgia. We encourage you to visit their website GAVREO.com and help connect people and dogs that need each other in their lives. You truly can make this world a better place by helping find homes of gold for these golden-hearted pups.
So I was really excited this year when the legislature, at least the House of Representatives, decided they want to do a study committee on election process because they get bills all the time. And some of them might be really necessary bills. Some of them might just be cleanup. Some of them take us in directions like removing the QR code from the ballot. And that might be a challenge, especially if there's no funding to provide a solution for that, like we find ourselves now. But the committee just wrapped up their sixth and what is supposed to be their last. There may be additional, possibly more meetings for that committee because they have touched on a ton of topics. Every one of the meetings have been just action packed with, well, action is probably the wrong word, but information packed with all types of different things about the elections process. And they've taken feedback from state election board members, from subject matter experts from around the country, from NCSL, also you guys. There have been a lot of election officials who've come, and also there's been a lot of public comment during those meetings. And I'd like to get your reaction to what you've seen and heard to what's happened and transpired in those committee hearings.
Well, I was also very excited when I heard about it. I think I may have used the phrase study committee when you were still sitting on the governmental affairs committee. It's so hard to have a nuanced conversation about anything during the session. It is just so busy and there's so much going on and bills are flying around and trying to get comment in and describe the why behind something is so difficult. I was very, very excited to see them or to hear that we're going to have a study committee outside of the session to delve into some of these issues.
Really go into a deep dive, right?
Oh, yeah.
They've gone really into the weeds.
Uh-huh. And for example, when some of my colleagues were invited, I spoke on behalf of my association, I think at the second meeting. We weren't really given there wasn't a wish list. They never said we want to hear about this. They just asked, what do y'all think we need to hear? And I was very grateful that they took that stance and really opened up the door to hear about what's affecting different election officials. And the other folks that spoke at the second meeting were speaking on behalf of themselves, but I know they talked to other officials and got input on their presentations before they spoke. So even though that was just them, they were still being collaborative, and I definitely appreciated them reaching out the way they did. But I'm very hopeful. I've been very impressed how the committee's handled everything, the topics they've taken on, the experts they brought in. It's been a very wide range of voices, and I'm hoping there's at least one more meeting for them to talk about the report itself and sort of what we should expect to see from that, and a discussion of what's going to go into that. But just where we're at right now, I think is light years ahead of where we've been in previous years. And I'm hoping that they continue doing this.
I think it's been one of the most productive study committees I've ever seen. So kudos to Chairman Fleming, Chairman Anderson, the members of that committee. They've done a fantastic job of really, like I said, diving into the weeds. Yeah. But there were a couple of issues, starting, I think, really with the second one in Cedartown, where this is the one where we started hearing directly from people in your position in different counties. Mm-hmm. And they were bringing specific concerns. And one of those things were the automatic voter registration as part of motor voter. There are times when people who are not eligible to vote, examples given were non-citizens or potentially people who are felons who are basically going directly from jail to go get their driver's license at the DMV. They're not checking the box to opt out. They're getting added to the voter registration list. And then you guys are having to spend a lot of time scrubbing it to make sure that these individuals are actually eligible to vote. And the law requires those local election officials to do a couple specific things if somebody has signed up and they're not actually eligible to vote. So like a non-citizen or a recently released felon who has not re-earned their voting rights, they have to be basically referred for prosecution. Those have to be sent to the DA, and it takes a lot of time. So can we talk about a little bit about that issue? And also,
Sure.
I think it would help our audience to know, what is that process like for you guys? How often is it happening? Is it happening daily? And then what is the process for you to actually determine this is not somebody that's supposed to be registered to vote?
Well, and I think that's a place to start the conversation is with the process. This is
Mhm.
not widely known. At least I don't think it is. So when people go to DDS to get their driver's license, to renew it, to apply for a new one, unless they opt out, as you mentioned, that information is sent to us automatically to either register them to vote or update the registration. As far as non-citizens go, it's worth noting that we rely on DDS to verify citizenship as opposed to verifying the information they send us. So the assumption's made that anything they send us is from a citizen, because the Department of Driver Services does track citizenship. And when anyone registers to vote, whether it's through DDS, well, not through, well, we do check to be sure they're a citizen the first time they register in the state. So let's say they didn't register as DDS. They turned in a manual handwritten application. We would enter that information into our voter registration system. They have to give us either their driver's license number or the last four of their social security number. If we have the full driver's license number, we would that will go to DDS and two databases. There'll be comparison between two databases overnight. It may take 2 or 3 nights to make that comparison to verify they're a citizen. If we have a social security number, it goes to the Department of Social Security Administration, and again, it may take 2 or 3 nights. But if we get back a negative response, that agency thinks that person's not a citizen, there's still a process we have to go through to check, because it could be they're newly naturalized, and we move faster than Department of Driver Services did in updating their record. So, because one of the things that happens after somebody's newly naturalized, usually, first thing, they register to vote. It's a big deal to them. It's the first time they've had that right. They want to exercise it. So it happens pretty quickly. Once someone's on that list of eligible voters, then there's periodically that list is compared to other agencies' lists by the Secretary of State's office, whether that's Department of Vital Records for death records, Department of Corrections for felony convictions, and not every felony conviction costs you the right to vote. The law talks about moral turpitude, and there's certain pleas that would protect that right to vote. I'm not an attorney. We rely on the state agencies to weed those pleas and those types of situations out of the list that we get. And then we'll see what we call our dashboard through the voter registration system, records to be compared. So here's the records from the Department of Vital Records that we think are on the matched records on the voter registration list. And we put them on the screen next to our records and say yes or no, that's a match. Same with potential felons. And I mention that because there's no way for us to check before we put them on the list. Now, if they were marked as deceased before a felon, we can follow up and check on that, either through whatever agency we work with on those issues. But
What would be an example of an agency you would work with in that instance?
probation office, for example. We'll always have a relationship with our local probation officer. We can call and say, hey, is this person considered still serving a felony sentence? Because the sad truth is that in many cases, when there's someone who's attempted to register to vote who still has that felony sentence, they think they've cleared their sentence. Probation officers aren't great about sending out, a letter saying you're done, you're finished, you're good to go. And there's something called unsupervised probation, where you're not going weekly, monthly to your probation officer anymore. As long as you don't get in trouble again, you've already paid your fines, everything else is already done. Probation period just hasn't expired yet. They consider unsupervised probation, but that's still a felony sentence, and they're not eligible to re-register yet. So, that I would say there's some discretion there on the part of offices like mine. That did this person say just not forget to opt out at EDS? or are they making a willful effort to register to vote? And in the conversations I've had, most of the time, people are horrified to hear they may have broken the law again, and are, I look at more as education, helping them, at least that first time around, than no, you've got to, you are in trouble, you committed another felony when they didn't even know they did it.
How often does it happen? Yeah, how often
Um,
does it happen for either of those scenarios? Somebody who's a non-citizen who goes to get a driver's license, they forget to check the box, or they they
well,
had to
a
check the box to opt out.
non-citizen, I don't know that I've ever seen that. And I heard somebody talk about that at the study committee meeting. I was very confused because it's on DDS to weed out those records coming
Right.
through to us. So even if we had an opt-in system, it still wouldn't correct that.
So with the Georgia Real ID, you have to bring your birth certificate, you have to bring some other form of identification, and then your driver's license has that little either gold or black star on it, and you have to have that now in order to fly on an airplane, a commercial airliner. So in Georgia, that is pretty much the only way you're getting
Well,
a driver's license
but
with
you don't have
the
to be a
Real
citizen.
ID star on it.
You don't have to be a citizen to get a Real ID.
The point of it is that we actually do know who you are
Well, absolutely.
when you get a Real ID.
Exactly. You can tell a license issue a non-citizen because this has a limited term on it. Once it goes to the state of Georgia, it'll say limited term, but that could be limited ID, same as everybody else's. But you're right; they know exactly who's a citizen, who isn't, based on documentation that's provided to them. It's a much better source of citizenship data than the elections office is.
Right. So one of the other topics that has come up is voter roll maintenance, and this is a hot topic. And there's a lot of debate right now about what is the best way to do our voter roll maintenance. We're under a federal law that limits the timing of when we can clean up, and the Secretary of State's really responsible for that, right? As far as making sure the voter rolls are accurate, and you guys have a role to play, but it's like ultimately his job.
Okay, so like our membership in ERIC, the Secretary of State's office is the member in ERIC, and they're responsible for facilitating a lot of those mass comparison processes to other state agencies. But the final determination of whether or not someone's removed from the list is the counties, not the states. So we're providing information to compare. But at the end of the day, it's somebody that works for the county that voter lives in that's deciding whether or not they stay on the list rather than the Secretary of State's office.
So before we go too much further into that, ERIC is the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's a multi-state compact where states are trading out information about people who have just registered here in my state. And they send it to ERIC. ERIC is a central database. And other states are also plugged into that. And they're getting notified that the voter registration needs to be canceled, the state where this person moved away from, so they're not eligible to vote in both places at one time. We've seen this used to great effect in Georgia. Hundreds of thousands of voters this year were cleaned off the rolls because they've moved away. And ERIC told us they now live in one of the other ERIC member states.
That's a summation of the process, but it still takes 4 years. Unfortunately, and that's because of our National Voter Registration Act, NVRA. And what that says in part is that unless we get word from the voter themselves of their signature, they want to come off the list, or another jurisdiction, another state sends us a copy of their original application with their signature, with all the information on it, applying to register to vote in that state, we can send them a notice saying, are you still there? Please let us know if you've moved so we can pull you off the list. Here's an easy way to do that. That voter cancellation portal we have now online, similar to our online registration portal, is, I think, an awesome idea. I'm glad we have it. Makes it a lot easier for folks who have moved in other states to pull themselves off the list. But most states protect that original application, including Georgia. And just getting a spreadsheet from another state saying, here's a list of all the names, name, social security number, even if they can send, name and say year of birth. This person now lives here. It's not enough for a tight match. And for the states that don't protect other information, even sending us more personal information doesn't do it. To beat NVRA, we have to have original application. So that's where we hear about active and inactive voters. If there's some reason we think they're not there anymore, or we haven't heard from you in a while, you go to an inactive status. You stay in inactive status for 2 general election cycles, 4 years, before we can remove you. And I really hope that Congress acts to update that law soon. That's a law that was written back when your email said you've gotten it. We didn't do things online. We were on postal service for everything. And that's not the case anymore, but our laws haven't caught up with that fact. And that's why it's so hard to keep these lists clean.
So what is the controversy? Because we've heard people in the, especially in the public comment, none of the credentialed subject matter experts who came before the study committee said that we should pull out of ERIC. There's legislation now in the House to get us out of ERIC, to pull us out. There have been several states that have pulled out. There are 25 states that remain in ERIC, half of them, plus the District of Columbia, so 26 jurisdictions, if you will. The states that are trying to pull out tend to be red states, and there have been many red states that have stayed in. But what is the controversy? Why wouldn't we want every state to be part of ERIC?
That's a really good question. The things I know about ERIC, and from talking to them, I don't work directly with ERIC. That's Secretary of State's office. But I had some conversations with a couple of their staffers. The data that we send to ERIC is hashed, meaning it's encrypted and it can't be decrypted. And that protects that personal information. The data is housed in a private entity, but it's run by the member states. For example, our state election director, Blake Evans, either is or
it's a past chairman.
Is the past chairman. So he is like the immediate past chairman now. He was involved with a lot of the policy discussions about ERIC and was integral to a lot of the changes they've made. So it's very responsive to its member states. This is a problem we've had as a country for a very long time, that registration elections are a state issue. So, and states each have their own privacy laws. We're not good at sharing with each other. And with the data we can share, it's hard to get a tight match on if somebody moves. There's a lot of Joseph Kirks in the United States right now. I'm guessing more than one of them has my date of birth.
Yeah, but only one wears a really cool hat everywhere.
I wouldn't even say that. There's a lot of people out there. Maybe they're at least wearing the vest. But we need also information to be compared in a safe manner, and the only operation out there right now that does that is ERIC. Now, how we act on information, how we're allowed to act on the information is a different conversation. But if we want to be sure folks aren't voting in multiple states, we should probably check.
Yeah.
And the only way to check right now is ERIC, because yes, there's state-to-state compacts. I know Georgia has joined those, but they're
not efficient though.
Eventually more work.
Right. It's a lot more work. You have to hire additional staff to do that. There's a much greater cost. It's slower. And then you have to negotiate those compacts with each individual state. Whereas if a state becomes a member of ERIC, it's uniform. It's a fixed cost. The cost is split equally amongst the member states. The more member states there are, the cheaper it is for the state. And the better the data is, because there are more states participating.
But the example I've used in the past to talk about sort of why folks want us out of ERIC. And this is from a conversation I had with somebody once. I was accused of being a pedophile because we're a member of ERIC, which confused me. And turns out the reasoning was, if you're not aware, you can register to vote in Georgia at 17 and a half. You can't vote until you turn 18. But if you're at DDS, if you want to go ahead and submit that application long before your first election, we allow that, because what happens if your date of birth is right after the registration deadline? You've got to be able to do it early, and you'll be eligible to vote in that first election. Well, because we were dealing with data for somebody who was less than the age of 18, must be pedophiles.
Oh my gosh.
So I say that just to point out that all these arguments make a lot of sense. I've never seen any indication that the data from ERIC was being used improperly. And if we're going to move away from it, we need another solution that works. Because I do think we need to be checking to see if people are voting in multiple states. If, it's in my best interest to have clean voter rolls. I'm
Yes.
making decisions based on staffing, supplies, how many ballots to order, how much, future growth for the county, all based on registered voters.
I mean, that's all great and good to want to have an efficiently run office, but also let's make sure there aren't people voting in 2 states in a presidential election. That's the value of ERIC, is it prevents that from happening. And this idea that we should get out of it, really, to me, nobody's made a case for why Georgia should pull out. And as a matter of fact, I've been telling people we need everybody. The problem with it is this. Let me tell you what the real problem with it, Joseph. And I'm going to get political. You don't have to join me in this part of the conversation. The problem is the Democrats, who have never wanted us to clean our voter rolls ever in this state, have come up and said, we like ERIC. We want you to stay in ERIC. And I wish they'd stop, because that's the nature of politics, is if the Democrats would just stop saying, be an ERIC, we need you in ERIC. And it makes no sense to me that Republicans are the ones saying, no, I guess we have to not trust this system because the Democrats like it. But this is a voter cleanup tool that allows us to have more accurate, there are always going to be opportunities for continuous improvement with voter roll maintenance. But it's the best tool we have. And it's literally hundreds of thousands of records are getting updated every year because of ERIC. So I don't know why it's gotten political. We're going to dive into that in a future podcast too. I don't want to put you on the spot.
When you do that, and I can't dive into that too deeply with you, but I would suggest that the story doesn't start in Georgia. Of course, we're still in it.
Right.
And
for now, hopefully
the reasoning there has always confused me. So, as you said, from my perspective, my colleague's perspective, I think we're not so invested in what tool we use. We just know we need a tool.
Right.
It's also worth mentioning, yes, people do vote in multiple states sometimes. It's not outcome determined. It's not huge numbers. I found one in my time here in Bartow County, and I started this job in 2007. We do check the best we can. We are looking, but to have a way of doing that, I think, is absolutely imperative to the country moving forward.
So one of the other things about ERIC is we sort of glossed over this, but I want to hammer this point home. When Barack Obama left office, right before he did, he made this executive order declaring elections infrastructure critical infrastructure. And we in Georgia had a very negative reaction. The federal government should not be involved in our elections. There was a state representative from South Georgia who actually brought a resolution telling the federal government, keep your hands out of our elections. We know we have issues. We're going to deal with them, but you don't have a place to tell us what to do when it comes to time, manner, and place of running our elections. I think I read that in the Constitution someplace. So we traditionally, as conservative Republicans, and not you, Joseph, but me on the red team, we've traditionally said, we don't want the federal government messing around with this stuff. And now we have this entity called ERIC that is state-based, state-run, state-controlled, without federal intervention, without federal funding. It's all funded by the states. That's the model. That's the federalist model. We don't want for the feds to come in and tell us how we're supposed to do this. When we have a tool like this, it's the best thing if you're a federalist. If you think the federalist model is the best way to govern, it's the best tool we can possibly have. The other option is to go out and create 49 plus the territories, 49 other compacts with other states that you have to individually negotiate, individually manage. The data is not going to be uniform. Everybody's going to have their own set of rules. And it's going to be an impossibility to actually get anything done and keep the voter rolls clean. There is no other alternative. And so you don't have to answer any of that question. That's just me going on a soapbox diatribe. But if you want to add something.
Well, one thing I'll add to that, talking about the whole idea of being critical infrastructure. One thing that did do that I was very grateful for, then and moving forward, is there's certain fights the federal government has to fight, I think. I've got a great IT director, for example. I don't think we expected to fight China or Russia. It takes a nation state to fight a nation state. And that critical infrastructure designation let us be part of what's called an ISAC, which is Information Sharing Analysis Center. Let us share, get cybersecurity resources at low or no cost from the feds. there was a lot of really good stuff there that, and that funding model is shifted now, where that's being done more through grants than through the ISAC. But just wanted to flag that since it came up, that there was some good to that critical infrastructure designation. As far as the other stuff goes, you're right. Either we have the state-run tool, or we have in my mind, the only other option is a federal option. I'm not sure we want to see a national voter registration record. But that's not for me to say. I am here to register the voters and count the votes. I'm just making tools to deal with.
We'll all of us in the peanut gallery will go argue. But when we come back, we're going to start talking about some of the conspiracy theory stuff that has popped up post 2020. We're talking a little bit about Coffee County, what happened down there, and why. Just why. I think that's probably the best way to frame that. Just why.
Peach Pundit has an anonymous Patreon who would like to invite you to learn more about the Alzheimer's Association. The Alzheimer's Association leads the way to end Alzheimer's and all other dementia by accelerating global research, driving risk reduction and early detection, and maximizing quality care and support. No one should fight Alzheimer's alone. With your help, no one will. Learn more on their website, alz.org.
Conservatives Concerned is a network of political and social conservatives who question the alignment of capital punishment with conservative principles and values. Our programs include educating conservatives about the failed death penalty system and mobilizing them to bring about its end. We come to this issue for a variety of reasons. Some believe that small government and the death penalty don't go together, especially when we compare the high costs of capital punishment to life without possibility of release. Some don't trust the state to get it right. We already know that some innocent people have been sentenced to death, and for others, it may already be too late. Some believe that the death penalty contradicts our values about protecting life. Find out more at conservativesconcerned.org.
On January 7th, yes, that January 7th, the day after the infamous January 6th, Misty Hampton was the elections director for Coffee County here in Georgia, and she allowed a team hired by Sidney Powell, who was an attorney that had said she was about to release the Kraken and had made all kinds of wild statements about Venezuela and coming in and hacking our elections, and she was going to prove it. So she hired this team to go down to Coffee County and found a willing dupe. You don't have to say that Joseph. That's my job. To give this team complete and total access to proprietary secret information about how the Dominion machines ran. They ended up copying the hard drives. And then there was also this video that she allowed them to create where she simulated a ballot adjudication process where she was telling them, look how easy it is under this system for me to swap the votes for these candidates from one candidate to the other. And that has remained the fuel for conspiracy theorists. That video specifically has remained fuel for conspiracy theorists and grifters throughout Georgia who want to continue to promulgate that the 2020 election was stolen and that every other election that has happened since then cannot be trusted, regardless of how many processes or security measures we put in place. So that's me setting it up. And I realize you're in a delicate situation, but if you could give our listeners, well, just what I'm really interested in is where was the breakdown? Because clearly Misty Hampton's facing charges for that. She's been indicted for it. Where was the breakdown and what prevents stuff like that from happening again in both cases? First, the giving clandestine access to sensitive equipment, and also, frankly, the ballot adjudication process. Can somebody who is a bad actor just go ahead and change all the votes that they want from one candidate to the other?
So I guess I'll start with the adjudication process. My memory of that video, and it's been years since I watched it, is that it was more focused on unvoted races and saying, look, this one's blank. I can just add a vote here.
Actually, it wasn't. She was actually changing votes.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And I may have just watched a little portion of it. But for anyone who's not aware, there are certain ballots after every election have to be what we call adjudicated, meaning there's a stray mark. The person was hand marking their ballots and marked two candidates when they should only have marked one. or marked one and crossed it out, then marked another one, even though the instructions say not to do that. Or there's a stray mark and the machine's not sure if that's a vote or not. It's a small mark. It didn't quite cross the threshold, but it's still there. So we need to look at that. We also adjudicate ballots for what are called UOCAV voters, people that are overseas in the military, who may receive their ballot electronically through, it's not through an email, but through a web-based system, print it out, mark it, mail it back into us. We have that physical ballot. We have to duplicate that ballot onto our ballot can be scanned, so that vote can be counted. And this is done by a bipartisan team.
It requires a member of each party to be there.
It's a representative of the board, or so a superintendent for the county, and then a member of each local party. They get to appoint to this process. If it's a nonpartisan race, a local judge appoints two upstanding members of the community to be part of that process. And the law has changed on who's required to be there over the years, but for adjudication specifically, it's always been this bipartisan team. So there's two ways of doing this. We can look at the ballots by hand, and then duplicate the selections onto a fresh ballot. And we mark one original, the other one duplicate. People are observing to make sure we duplicate it properly. It's very time consuming, and all you need to do, it's a pen. And there's no log that goes with it. You just go through and do this. The other way is through the voting system itself has what's called an adjudication module, where any ballot that has a stray mark that meets certain threshold values or has certain triggers on the image will come up on the screen, and we stand there with a member of each party and go through one ballot at a time and say, okay, well this one, the voter obviously crossed out one choice and bubbled in the other, so that first mark's not a vote, but the second one is. And then we tell the system, okay, the top one shouldn't be counted, but the bottom one should. And Misty was right. We do have the ability to do that in that system, but the original ballot image, the original ballot stays unchanged. So when we go back to audit the results, that original ballot's still there, and we go back through the adjudication process again to re-adjudicate it to be sure we come to the same conclusion. And I've had one in years of audits that was adjudicated properly to begin with, didn't change the results of the election, but the audit did catch that mistake. And I remember when that video was posted, actually reaching out to her out of concern, because I thought she just didn't understand the process. Because the concern she was raising, that if somebody's there with no oversight, some bad intentions,
right?
They could change a vote. They could bubble in an oval for somebody in an unvoted race, because you don't have to vote for every race on the ballot. And I think I asked her if she knew what a pen was, because that
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that conversation.
It didn't last long after that. But because the idea that it takes this sophisticated system that tracks what it's doing, that leaves clear evidence of what happened, is a better way to try to change someone's vote than just having insider access to the ballots and bubbling in with a pen, blew my mind. But that's what the allegation is. So, we're always on the lookout for insider threats, which is what that was. And there are certain rules in place through the state election board, through Secretary of State's office, of what security has to be on the voting system. We have to have, we have to authorize access to it. We need to log who has access to that special space. It has to have a security system or a camera system. There's a list where you pick 2 or 3 off the list rather than do the entire list. But it's important that we have that. But can we ever really be fully safe from insider threats? No, that's why they're called insider threats. All we need is put a system in place where we can see what happened and track changes over time. So if something does go wrong, we can track back what happened and know who's responsible.
So when Misty was showing those people making that video, look, I can change this vote to that. It was creating a log, an electronic log of those changes, right? How easy is to change that log?
Well, I think it's important to know that when you make that change on the screen, again, the image doesn't change. All the original marks are still there. There's if you've ever seen a Dominion ballot image, there's the front and back of the ballot, and then a third page for how the system interpreted that ballot. It's called the audit mark, I believe. The only place that the adjudication module changes is on the audit mark itself. So it'll say we originally interpreted it to this, and then it was changed to this.
And then we have this risk limit audit that does the hand count. And in 2020, all of the ballots, it wasn't just sample, it was all of the ballots, multiple times counted by hand. And we ended up getting the same numbers because whenever you're hand
Right.
counting,
We
there's always
always
a
see a
small
small margin.
error.
Yeah.
Right. But it's significantly, it's statistically insignificant. And it's certainly not enough error to overcome a margin of victory.
Right.
And so we have a greater confidence that the election actually went to the winner.
And it's important to know that, for example, on the ballot marking device ballots, that or on either one of the ballots, actually, either type, that audit mark that I described isn't there. They all had to be re-adjudicated as part of the audit to verify the results. So if something had happened with that adjudication module, things had happened to try to change the results, that audit would have caught it. Oh, not only did we look at say it was duplicated by hand, we didn't just look at the duplicated ballot, we looked at the original ballot to go with it to verify they matched, and then included those results in the audit. And that was again by the bipartisan team.
At this last committee hearing for the Blue Ribbon Committee, the Georgia Municipal Association came forward and said, you know what, early voting's awesome. We love early voting, but we have to pay for that. And we're getting days where nobody shows up because we have 525 cities in the state of Georgia, and not all cities are made the same. Here in my city of Holly Springs, there are about 23,000 people who live here. In a smaller city, there might be 500 people that live in that city. There are cities that are even smaller than that. They want to run their municipal elections for their council and their mayor. They're paying for it, and they're paying for all these extra days of early voting. What is your sense about that? So what kind of reform would be appropriate there?
You should ask, because I think I actually mentioned this in front of the study committee. To give a very concrete example, I have a city in Bartow that had a tragedy when the elected officials passed away, and they were forced to have a special election back in 2023. The city has 451 voters, or did. Of those 451 voters, 102 voted on election day. During advanced voting, overall turnout about 27%, which really isn't bad for a special election. The per vote cost for where election day personnel costs about $1,300. It's 14. Advanced voting personnel for 17 days costs almost $11,000. So the per vote cost for election day vote was like 13 and a half, a little bit less. During advanced voting, almost $550 a vote, just in personnel costs. Advanced voting is very, very important. We rely on that, especially in statewide elections, to keep our election day lines lit. But as you mentioned, not every city is created equal, and I think that same person talked about it may have been cheaper to go door to door than to run at home.
Yeah, we don't want mobile voting. No, that's not a great idea.
No, but I think the point's, it's not a good policy choice.
But the argument was, hey, there are cheaper ways to do this.
Right.
Yeah, and it becomes political because we get criticized anytime you want to take away early election days, early voting days, because obviously you're just trying to suppress people and limit people's opportunities. There could be no other reasonable or logical, I'm being sarcastic, reason. But the cities are asking, hey, look, our larger cities, 17 days might make sense. The city of Atlanta, Decatur, these, Duluth, these cities, it may make sense to have 17
and we
days.
can't legislate a population, but my understanding is we can legislate by the number of registered voters, by historical trends, and
it would require a constitutional amendment to allow it, I think. But there's no consensus between the two parties right now to allow that to happen.
But I think that another important point to make, besides the fact that we're not trying to disenfranchise voters, at the end of the day, myself and my colleagues just want to do a good job facilitating the process. There's another podcast I mentioned before to you out there called High Turnout, Wide Margins, because that's what we want. We want high turnout and wide margins. We don't care who wins, just we want to win big. It is an old joke in elections. But there's also been a trend the last, I don't know how many years, for uniformity. And there's certain things that uniform makes a lot of sense for. A statewide voting system makes a lot of sense. Statewide voter registration system makes a lot of sense. But what's right for my citizens is very different than what's right for the citizens down in Screven County on the coast, that's so small, or Gwinnett or DeKalb County that's so large. The whole point of local controlled elections is so we can meet the needs of our citizens in a way that works for our citizens. So maybe the answer is giving professionals a little bit of discretion to be professionals.
You could set a minimum number of days.
Exactly.
And then if there's a larger city, they can adopt more. I think that would be something that would pass constitutional muster. Last question before I get you out of here, Joseph, you've been great, is there was a bill passed and signed into law last year to take the QR code off the ballot. Now, I will take this opportunity to say if only someone could have known, because I was the only Republican in either chamber to vote against putting QR code ballot on the ballots in the first place. And I said at the time, this is going to cause trouble because people are going to point to the QR code and they're going to say, I don't know what is on that QR code and I don't trust what's on my ballot. Well, not, to be very clear, the entire time I have said, I don't think that is a legitimate concern, but even illegitimate concerns cause people to have doubt if there are people out there taking that and creating a narrative and trying to exploit that for their preferred outcomes. And that is what we have seen. They point to the QR codes. So the legislature has listened and said, all right, we're going to get rid of the QR codes. That law becomes effective July 1st this coming year, ahead of the midterm elections. And yet the legislature has not been able to actually fund the effort to make that happen. How are you dealing with that?
Well, the way I always like to start this, just get on my own soapbox for just a second. I promise to be short. I think that there's a lot that's good about what we call summary ballots. Ballots are being used print right now with QR codes on them. The fact of the matter is, no matter how expensive your pen is, whether you mark it with a touchscreen, and it prints out a printer, or you bubble it and oval next to a name, you as the voter, me as the official, has no way of knowing that vote's being allocated properly without checking. And that check would be an audit.
Which is also
audits.
The audit was my baby. I said at the very least, you have to go and check the paper.
And there's some really interesting things we can leverage with optical character recognition. It's a thing called transitive audits. That image audit that we did last year started actually as a conversation about transitive audits. I actually rescanned every ballot cast in journal election last year as a different form of audits and went through an OCR process. So we had 2 different tabulated results to verify not only the QR code was recorded right, but all those ballots were tabulated properly. We can't lose sight of that as if we switch back to hand-marked ballots, because just because we marked an oval doesn't mean that it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all of our problems. It just makes some things a little bit harder. But you're right. Public confidence is important, and if that's what the public wants, then we will implement the will of the legislature and make that happen. And we'll do it the best we can. And I appreciate them working with us in these discussions about how we're going to make that transition. But as far as what we're going to do July 1st next year, I don't know. If we need to make this change responsible. And the first part of my career was in the implementation of voting technology. It's something that I kind of know what I'm talking about. And one of the biggest things we need is a firm plan and funding to get all the stuff we need in time to get it done. And if we wanted to move towards either hand-marked ballots or even the machines printing a full-face ballot by July 1st of next year, and a full-face ballot would be printing a ballot looks very similar to what we think of as absentee ballots, where it's the full ballot, ovals and all, with your selections already bubbled in on it. That's a possibility. I personally think it's a solution search for a problem, unless we're doing hand marked for most voters, in which case it makes the ballots the same for the disabled voters, which is important. But I digress. That needed to be funded during the last legislative session.
Right.
Even if we move day one of the next session, I don't see us having enough time to get to every county in Georgia to upgrade or provide new equipment.
You got to go through an RFP process, right?
Well,
even
if we did the system we had now, we upgraded it to be able to print that full face ballot for disabled voters, and we did the software upgrade on the servers and the BMDs that we're going to use. We still have to provide BMDs at every location, in-person location, for the disabled community.
Right. That's part of HAVA, the Help America Voters Act. You have to have some BMDs. Every state has BMDs of some sort because they are HAVA, or Help America Voters Act, compliant. And the folks who are not able to hand mark a ballot have to have that as an alternative, or they're blind and they have to have a headphone that has it read to them.
Folks have to be able to vote privately and independently in person. I think it's a
Right.
great law, and I've seen voters really appreciate, doing that for the first time in their lives. It is a heartwarming thing to see someone who's visually disabled, who's never voted for themselves before, have their first chance to do that.
Right.
It's one of the things that keeps me going in this job, seeing stuff like that. But even if we keep the system we have now without the funding, and if we weren't already working on it, there's no way to get that done, I think, by July 1st. So what that means for the future, I don't know. Election officials can be our own worst enemies. We tend to do what we have to do to get the job done. And we've shown time and time again that we, at the end of the day, do get the job done, make successful elections, but it seems to incentivize, well, they got that done, they can do it again. And eventually it's not going to work. And this may be the time where enough time without enough resources.
The rollout of the Dominion machines was absolutely tragic. You had 6-hour-long lines in some of the more heavily populated places for the presidential election in 2020. And it were,
yes and no. I'm not sure that was as much about the new machines as it was about a pandemic. And if we're talking about the same location, like 3 or 4 polls in the area, throwing them out in the week leading the election and forcing them all to go to one location, that's too small for that number of voters.
yeah, but you also had during the pandemic a record number of people vote by mail, which were all hand-marked paper ballots. So I think I was on the committee. We studied the problem, and that's what gave birth to SB 202, were the problems that we had, which we mandated an increased number of machines at these locations as one of the ways of dealing with that. But there were a whole other little tweaks in there that helped improve the voter experience, because by the time the next election rolled around, it was like velvet. It was so smooth. You guys did such a great job. And the second time around using that technology. But anytime you make the change, you have to implement the change. And in this case, in order to implement the change, you have to have the funding to do so. The funding does not exist today. The legislature did not appropriate the funds. That was a conscious decision by them, because it was brought up. I know it was brought up to the appropriators. Hey, this is out there. Are you going to do anything about it? It's come up during the Blue Ribbon Committee, where countless people have come to the committee and said, what are you going to do here? When I go to read the report that comes out of this committee, I'm going to skip to that section, right? What is the recommendation? That's what because there are options on the table. They could punt.
Yeah.
They could push the effective date out, and that would be a very simple cleanup bill that they could pass on day 15 or so, where it's early enough and it gets set to the future, past the midterms. But otherwise, if they don't, and it stays the way that it is, if they don't punt, or if they don't come up with a solution that works within the infrastructure that you already have, I'm afraid of lawsuits. There, obviously there are people here who are so happy. We engaged in a lawsuit last year. I don't want to ever do that again. I don't plan on ever doing that again. Super stressful and it's super expensive. I don't recommend. 0 stars. Do not recommend engaging in litigation. But it's a problem, right? I mean, and so far we haven't heard the solution. But if they didn't do anything, just Joseph, not GAVREO, just Joseph.
I don't have a good answer right now.
Yeah.
We have emergency procedures.
That's not a great thing.
But here's what I know, Drew. I know that we have spent years moving in a direction to take so that poll workers don't have to make decisions on, say, what ballot to give a person. One of the benefits of our current poll pads, our current voting system, is when you go to check in, we check Scott in, and then it automatically gives Scott the ballot that's right for Scott based on where he's registered to vote, where he lives.
Right. So in my voting precinct, in my voting precinct, I might vote for a different state rep than the person 5 blocks from me.
You might
But
vote
we're
for
still in the
state
same voting
across the
precinct.
street from you.
Right. Yeah, that's possible too. And we've had a lot of elections where the lines weren't properly drawn down the middle of the street. And the Dan Gassaway example is the most famous in my mind, where the line was just not in the right place and a whole bunch of people got to vote in his election that shouldn't have voted. And it had to be rerun 3 times from the
So,
first time to the final time.
and that doesn't even, and that's with a system where the poll workers couldn't give out the wrong ballot. Whatever's in the system was what ruled.
Right. Imagine
Now
the chaos
imagine-
that would be in place if the poll worker on election day is like, I think this
I
is
don't-
yours.
I don't have to imagine.
Right.
If you look back, say at 2020, the way we did advanced voting back then was not on the poll pads. So the poll worker had to check the voter in, use in something that related to Jarvis or the ElectionNet back then, our voter registration system, to determine their precinct and ballots and district combination, and then give them to a separate device, the poll pad, put in that precinct district combination, and create their ballot for them. And we know from looking at the data from that election how many times that was done incorrectly. When they were busy, they were tired, just hit the wrong thing on the screen. The voter did not know maybe what school board district they were in or what house district and voted the wrong ballot. So I know that we need a system that will help the poll workers give the voters the right ballot. If that's a hand mark system, it means ballot on demand printers for advanced voting locations, for precincts that have splits is what we call it, what you just described. At a ballot on demand printer, we have a way to print ballots at the county level right now, called a vote ballot printer. Different. Ballot on demand means that when Scott comes in, we check him in, rather than creating a green voter access card, it automatically prints Scott's ballot. Then we hand that ballot to Scott and go on the next person. So even if we use our emergency procedures for hand marked ballots, we still need a way to generate the ballots for the voters, to make sure that there's integrity, that there's confidence in those elections. And that takes fun. I know that it's going to take time to educate the poll workers. Again, if we're going back to hand marked ballots on new workflows, for example, one thing we've not seen in Georgia, I think, in a long time is, if you ever noticed on our Dominion scanners, there's 2 big buttons there when you scan your ballot. It's either yes or no, or cast or return. I forget what's on them. They never activate for us. If we start using hand marked ballots, they will, because that's there to give what's called second chance voting. That's again from HAVA. After
Example is if I vote for 2 candidates in the same race.
It warns you, hey, there's an overvote. This race is going to be counted. Or there's an undervote. You can still vote for this if you want to. And there'll be a workflow that moves back from the scanner to spoil the ballot for the voter, give them a new one so they can remark it, or let them go back to a booth to finish marking the ballot if they missed a race, that we need to be prepared for and change the layout of our polling places for. There's still a lot to be thought about. That shouldn't be at the last minutes. We need time to do this right, to think through it. We need time to pilot a new method of voting. It's not as simple as just flipping a light switch. And when I say pilot, I mean something, a special election, odd number year, hopefully, municipal elections, where it's a smaller election where we spend more time looking at the details of the process, design new processes, try new processes, rather than just roll it out and say, here it is. So, and like I said, I know that needs to be ideally in an odd numbered year. So we're not doing a statewide rollout in a presidential year, gubernatorial year. That does not set us up for success.
Right. Anything else you want to cover before we get out of here?
Well, the thing I always try to cover, and I think this is probably preaching to the choir with your audience, but if you can't tell, I love talking policy. I love talking about the nuts and bolts of elections. I think many of my colleagues feel the same way. If folks out there have questions about the process, I highly recommend they talk to the local official, meaning the person at the county office, local board members, not the poll workers. Those folks are not there to set policy. They have no say in what's going on. Please don't take out your frustrations on the poll workers. They do get paid. At least in my county, I know they get paid, but they are lightly paid volunteers that we need to make this process work. So please be nice to them, thank them.
Please be nice to them.
And keep all the policy discussions for people in my position. And I would truly appreciate that.
Well, Joseph, thank you for being here. You've been listening to Peach Pundit, the podcast. Every week we mention the people who rock. These are the people who voluntarily reach into their pocket and give us just a few dollars to help us keep the lights on. And we really appreciate them. You can join them by going to patreon.com/peachpundit. I also remind you that if you'd like to be entered into the Peach Pundit merch giveaway, all you have to do is leave a comment wherever you're listening, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you listen. Just drop a comment. That'll get you an entry into that merch giveaway. The people who rock are Robert Lee and our friends at Lisa X Media, Brett Harrell and our friends at Conservatives Concerned, Bill Werkheiser, our anonymous contributor who wants you to know more about the Alzheimer's Association, Tony West and our friends at Americans for Prosperity, John Vestal, Colin Martin, Ryan Purvis, Hank Burnham, Jeff Cobble, Shannon Ferguson, Jordan Reed, Sam Thomas, Lawton Sack, Eric Johnson, Kenyatta Mitchell, Sergio Ortega, Amy Davis, Greer Howard, Reed Powell, Ryan Graham, Bo Brandon, Mike Buchert, Stuart Wilkinson, James Hall, Justin Wright, Bethany Ballard, Ken Pullen, and this week's brand new anonymous contributor. Again, if you don't want your name mentioned, just tell me you want to be anonymous. That guy did. Thank you again for listening to Peach Pundit, the podcast. We'll catch you next time. Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks for having me.